Time for another video, and before we get started, a big thank you and shout out once again to everyone who's liked and subscribed so far. I've had some really nice conversations with some of you, and I feel like I'm learning a lot from you guys, so hopefully you continue to find my videos helpful. I'd like this to become a place where we can all help each other grow and share what we're learning. If you are new here, welcome. I'm trying to improve my painting and drawing skills across a 10,000 hour time frame, but make my improvement as fast and efficient as possible by using techniques from the world of meta-learning, neuroscience, and autodidacticism. If you've been following along so far with my previous videos, you know what sort of very abstract, generic things we need to train to improve our art in general, the skills that are required to draw anything, which we call the skill pillars. And I've worked out my current artistic limitations based on these pillars and set them as my goals. Today we will look at one possible way to begin training those skill pillars efficiently by leveraging some of the developments made in the field of neuroscience. This video represents the first art learning experiment for this channel, and it will be ongoing. I'm currently using this method experimentally to manage my daily training, which I post as shorts here on YouTube. Let me start this by saying that I am not a neuroscientist. I'm a keen neuroscience and meta-learning enthusiast, but I'm very much at the end of the line where I take the things the scientists believe to be true and try to apply them to learning art. I don't run these experiments in the true scientific sense as such, but I do try to be as thorough as possible and record what things I notice about myself as I apply them. By sharing these things with you, I can compare my experience with yours, and then we can hopefully see where certain approaches might be helpful to others. So please bear those points in mind, and if you are watching this as a scientist or teacher or as a professional artist, please feel free to comment and point out any improvements I can make. Like I say, I'm here to learn and all input is welcome. To start, I want to preload your minds with some of the concepts that we will be covering today. We will be looking at declarative knowledge, which relates to learning facts, ordered lists, and other pieces of information. You can think of this as theoretical knowledge. Procedural knowledge, which relates to more creative and abstract things like music or art. You can think of this as practical skill or ability. Spaced repetition, which is an evidence-based learning technique that we'll be looking closely at. Active recall, which is the process of trying to remember something you have learned and put it to use. Metacognition, which is self-awareness of how you personally work and learn. Compounding, which is the aggregated long-term build-up of smaller repeated efforts. Think of this as a bucket being slowly filled drip by drip. Interleaving, which is mixing up your study subjects instead of studying them in individual blocks. And internalization, which is the process of stuffing knowledge into your long-term memory or developing a physical reflex so that it can be called upon will. Whoa, that was a lot. And if some of that sounds scary or technical, please don't worry. It's all very, very simple stuff that you've been doing all along without realizing it. All we're going to be doing is highlighting it, looking at when it happens and how we can take advantage of it all. You see, the brain is an amazing thing. We can use it to learn any skill from languages to gymnastics, but there is one big problem with it. It doesn't come with an instruction manual. Neuroscience and meta-learning could be thought of as trying to write that manual so that others can put their brains to its most effective use. Most of this work has been aimed towards that declarative knowledge thing I mentioned. For example, let's say you decided to brush up on your history and learn the names of every king and queen of England from Aethelstan in 925 AD right the way up to Charles III. That's 63 monarchs in total, by the way, across a 1200-year time span. Now, techniques have been developed that can help you very, very quickly memorize that entire list and remember it for a very long time. In fact, if you reviewed it regularly, you would never forget it. The same is true for memorizing the order of cards in multiple decks, the digits of pi, you get the idea. Medical students use these techniques for learning the minutiae of human anatomy, and language students use them to learn vocabulary and phrases. But let's look at language for a second. Say you go away and totally internalize the 625 most commonly used Spanish words. This would actually allow you to speak a staggering 80% of all everyday Spanish sentences. Sweet, so you book a ticket to Madrid, and when you get there, there's a problem. Everyone you talk to speaks really, really fast, and they all have different accents, they use slang that you've never heard before, they omit syllables like Bad Bunny, and suddenly your list of words isn't that useful. This is where procedural knowledge comes in. You see, knowing the theory is not enough. You have to be able to do the thing you are learning. And that means, in the case of languages, applying your 625 Spanish words in random orders, in real scenarios, listening out for them, saying them, and that is where true internalization takes place. We can think about these concepts as simply knowing and doing. The kings and queens list I gave earlier is purely declarative, and language seems to be part declarative, part procedural. Some things, like learning to walk or ride a bicycle, are totally procedural. Nobody can explain it to you, there is no theory, you just have to persevere until your brain figures it out. So, what would this look like for the fields of drawing and painting? Do you think this is more a case of knowing or doing, or a mixture of both? These are the questions I started asking myself, and when it comes to applying all of this neuroscience stuff to learning art, there really aren't many answers out there. You see, within the world of meta-learning, the procedural learning, the doing bits, don't have as many applicable techniques as the declarative, knowing type of subjects. The only things I can find are related to language and music. Drawing and painting are mostly procedural. There is some declarative stuff in there that will definitely make you better, and that's what's normally covered in most of the art books that you've probably read. You learn the rules of perspective and colour theory, and how the muscles of the upper arm look, or how to draw anime eyes, but you won't be able to use it or even truly understand it until you draw or paint using that knowledge. But there is so much of this knowledge that it's overwhelming, and then you also need to practice it seemingly for years before you even become any good at it. This leads to a lot of newcomers to art feeling overwhelmed, unmotivated, or heading down a path of practicing things that are of no real benefit to them, like copying their favourite anime. That's how I started out, and I wasted a lot of time. We need a smarter way to master this stuff that makes progress as quickly as possible, even though this is still clearly a huge undertaking and commitment of your time and effort. There are no shortcuts like some other YouTubers might promise you, but there are ways to learn this stuff more efficiently. Art wasn't the first thing I tried to use meta-learning to improve at. I had some success in learning to code, as well as with languages and mathematics, and a few other things. I made these leaps and bounds using a technique called spaced repetition learning, so let's take a look at that next. It's a very simple concept. Let's say we want to learn the Japanese word for frog, which is kaeru. If you didn't already know that, and I asked you what it is in 5 minutes time, you'll probably remember it. But if I ask you tomorrow morning, well, maybe you have a good memory, but most people will find that it started to deteriorate. You might know it began with a K, but nope, can't recall it. It was sitting in your short-term memory, and you never used it, so your brain just threw it away. Spaced repetition simply means that we review the information in our short-term memory, which refreshes it, and repeat this at longer and longer intervals until it gets placed in our long-term memory. Then, in 6 months' time, when I ask you what frog is in Japanese, boom, kaeru. You might have experienced this yourself through things like flashcards and found that although it worked, you eventually stopped using the cards and the knowledge faded. What you need is a way to somehow automate this process, like a spaced repetition scheduler of sorts, that tells us when to grab those cards and review them. The good news is, many actually exist. The one I use is called Anki, and I'm not affiliated with it in any way, but I do recommend it. It's open source and free, but for some reason not on Apple products, so you might have to find an alternative like Memrise if you use iOS. People use Anki and other apps like it to manage their flashcards so they can essentially never forget the things they want to learn. It works great for situations like kaeru, but could it work for art? The problem, as we've seen, is that most of these spaced repetition products and techniques exist for declarative, theory-based things, and as we've seen, getting good at art is really more a case of procedural knowledge, or doing it. So I began, as far as I know, the never-before-attempted task of trying to learn painting and drawing via spaced repetition. The things you see me produce so far in all of my videos are all footage of me using Anki to learn art this way. It's how I've gotten to the level I have, but it's taken me about 3 years. But I really think it's helped me to experience a large and unquestionably obvious increase in my skill compared to what I'd accomplished previously. So let me share with you what my Anki decks look like. Anki decks consist of flashcards that you make yourself or download, and these are all cards I have made myself. I've been at this for a few years now, since about 2020, playing with how I format the cards and gradually refining them so that they make sense to the way my brain works. I've gone through most of the courses on Schoolism, a whole bunch on Udemy and Domestika and Learn Squared, as well as a lot of Gumroad content for the artists I showcase during these videos. I've also made cards from YouTube channels I admire, the Ross Draws art course and Sam Does Art's Patreon videos, and more recently a bunch of books on painting and drawing which are the most recommended in their respective fields. Of all of these resources, the books have actually proved the most useful, and I believe there is a reason for this, but I'm going to save it for a future video as it would mean sidetracking. As an example, let's look at the book How to Draw by Scott Robertson. In my opinion, this is the best book I've found to date on learning to draw in the most generic sense. This book lays out in a clear and logical pathway, quite literally, how to draw, starting at drawing lines freehand and taking you right the way up to very complex vehicles. All I have to do is turn each key concept, which is usually a single page in the book, into an Anki card. I do this by working from a Kindle version of the book and screen capturing the pages. If no ebooks available, I buy a hard copy and actually use a book scanner to scan the book in so that I can make cards from it. Yes, I know that's nuts and a lot of effort, but that's how deeply I believe in testing these methods out. I see it as putting the work in up front and then benefiting from being able to use the book here in Anki for the rest of my day studying art, so it's worth the initial headache for me. A scanned page turned into a card looks like this. The front has the card title, which is also usually what I will be isolating for study. The back has the scanned or screen grabbed pages. To capture an entire book like this takes about an evening or two. From there, I have to work through the book, reading each card and prepping it. Let's take something like this card from the book Landscape Painting by Mitchell Arbala as an example. It talks about simplification and massing, the key idea, so I read the card and write questions on the front of the card that directly relate to these key ideas. This is that declarative learning thing I was talking about earlier. Some art knowledge is declarative, like what the cone of vision is for a human being, it's 60 degrees by the way, or how many value steps are in the Munsell color chart, which is 10, and these prompts are designed to help me memorize the stuff I personally believe is important to me. Next up, I write a challenge for each card that contains the key idea. This is the key component I was missing when I started doing this originally. Each page of the book represents a key idea, and so now this card has isolated and captured that key idea. I have a declarative and procedural aspect to each card. We need to immediately apply this small isolated art concept in a way that means we can train it like a sports drill. That's how we actually make ourselves able to do it, which is the procedural part of learning art. Challenge for this card is to create a value study of a scene from life or reference using up to 10 values and trying to keep it to as few as possible. Focus is on trying to group small or medium detailed areas into singular big shapes for as much of the image as possible. I use the back of the card to write notes which represent my current thoughts on this small isolated art concept so that I can read what I was thinking about last time I saw it and track my learning. I also find that as I learn different things, I can relate knowledge in a cross-referencing manner, and this sometimes changes the way I actually understand a card, so I can track those changes over time here as well. Preparing a deck like this can take a little while, so I do it gradually. The hardest bit is just working out what challenges to use for each card, because some are not that obvious. Once we've prepared a deck like this, we can begin what I call circulation, which is where we actually study a card. I do this based on what I need to learn. My current focus, based on my goals, is on learning about colour theory and painting with gouache so I can find cards that relate directly to that and bring them into circulation. So to show you what that looks like, you should join me for my training today. If you watched my video on baselining, then you know I'm not very good at painting really. I don't understand how colour works, I have very limited experience with both digital and traditional tools, and so most of the cards I'm circulating at the moment relate to improving at these things. This card comes from the book Rediscovering Gouache by Alosha Blau, and the thing it isolates is painting with gouache in glazes, and specifically building an image up by starting with the lightest parts and progressively getting darker. You can see I have a few declarative parts at the top just to kickstart my brain a little, the difference between a glaze and a wash, what it is in his eyes at least, which is just a matter of timing. Washes are usually painted wet on wet, but a glaze is when you let the current layer dry completely, then go on top with the next layer. The danger with gouache is that doing this can reactivate the previous layer and lead to the layers blending into a mess, so some care is required. The final question is actually a bit of a trick one because you can work from both light to dark and dark to light, but it depends on the paint opacity and the consistency you're using, so you'd most likely plan ahead and find the best approach based on what you are drawing. And now for the procedural part, the challenge, and it's quite simple. Paint a small study using this glazing method. I use his series of images on the card as a guide to how the paint should look, and also try to stick to a similar subject matter to make the comparisons easier, which is why you may have seen me painting dogs recently. On the reverse of the card is the excerpt from the book, so I can reread it and refresh myself. I tried refreshing before the studies, during and after, and I tend to find that doing it before returns the best results, giving me a clear and defined idea of what I need to do right now so I can apply it immediately to the current challenge. Over time, different parts of the text jump out at you, or a certain sentence takes on a new meaning where your understanding of things has evolved, which is why rereading the text is so important. You rarely understand what the author truly means until you have some mileage under your belt. I find a good reference on Pinterest and sketch it out without spending too much time on it. Sketching and accurate proportions are not the main focus here, so yeah, I try my best, but I don't really mind if it's slightly off. I've been drawing long enough that I don't find this too difficult, so unless I'm having a bad day, the drawing will be decent enough that I can get somewhere without having to spend an hour making everything perfect. I'm going to do 2 studies for this card today, each one 30 minutes or so, but the biggest setback when doing this is the drying time, because I need each layer to be dry for it to truly see how it works, so I might need to invest in a hairdryer or something to speed that up. That means today's training may take longer than 1 hour. On the back of the card, you can see the notes I've made for it, which give me some further instruction about what I've been trying, what things I've been working, what things I should avoid. Because I'm still fairly new, and to make life easier, I've also been only using one colour, working monochromatically. I use 3 brushes, a big wash brush and then a couple of smaller ones for more detailed work. I have a very fine one for adding thin lines and details. I'm testing different paint consistencies as I do this one working, and I found that a milky to single cream consistency works best so far. I also have 2 brands of gouache I've been playing with. The expensive one works way better, which is a key lesson, but I can make the cheaper ones more opaque by mixing them with the expensive whites, which makes them smoother and more pleasant to use. I've been using the same 350 GSM watercolour pad for these and have written a note to try this on a pre-stretched sheet to see what that feels like, so that's something I'm going to quickly be doing after training today in preparation for the next time I see this card. I have some notes regarding things like how much darker to make each layer, the differences between using black to darken as opposed to omitting the black entirely and just starting with white mixed in with a hue and then adding more of the same hue to darken. In terms of the skill pillars, you could argue that I'm working colour, value, form and technical skill here, and you would be right, but my emphasis here is actually on the technical skill pillar, learning how gouache handles when working in glazes. After my first study, which actually took 40 minutes, I take a small break and do something totally different. There is a reason for this, and I will cover it, but in a future video. I compare what I've produced with what Blau has, and I note that mine feels texturally different. The shapes are not as interesting, and I also felt I could make the drawing a little more stylized like his. I also think a lot of this is caused by being quite stiff and quite careful because I'm new to this, and so I allow myself that difference, but will try to be a bit more spontaneous on this next study. I then jump back in and repeat this exercise, trying to improve based on what I felt went wrong in that first study. I switched to the fancier gouache paints, but still working monochromatically, and I use a bigger brush. The reference also has more defined light and shadow shapes, which makes my life easier. I tried to be a bit faster, and I also didn't care as much about the drying this time, leading to a faster working time of just 26 minutes. The initial tone wasn't as dark, and I tried to use fewer layers in total, with more of a value jump in between than the first study. I feel that the better paints made a big difference, and the bigger brush made me less careful and more spontaneous with my shapes. This is only my 6th or so attempt at trying these studies, and my 3rd or 4th attempt at seeing this card. When I first started it, I failed horrifically at making an animal, so the next time I just painted cubes. Once I got a bit of a feel for how the glazing works, I felt more confident tackling an animal, and here we are, so far so good. I'm making some progress each time. Before stopping for the day, I think about what still needs work, and I jump into Photoshop quickly to investigate something about Blau's images here. I think next time I'd like to try and use more than one colour and attempt something like he has in his example, so I quickly take a look at what colours he's used. The image is predominantly red with some more obviously yellow parts in the base layer. The darker bits are a lot cooler, virtually violet in colour. Also I wanted to see how much darker he was making each layer, which confirmed to me that I need to darken a bit more than I currently am for each layer and account for the fact that gouache does not dry the same value as it does while it's wet. Sometimes I take a photo or screen grab of my most recent attempt and add it to the card so that I can review it, but because I have this sketchbook there's no need for that here. Hopefully you can see how this card has captured an isolated concept within the wider field of art that I am training directly to improve on a specific weakness I have. Let's call this targeted training. And I really do concentrate when I'm doing this. I have total focus and no distractions. The last thing to cover are the buttons at the very bottom of the Anki card. Normally, when learning something declarative, we decide how easily we're able to recall the information and use these 4 buttons, ranking from 1, where we couldn't recall it, to 4, where we found it super easy. The button we pick will tell the algorithm how well we understand this piece of information, and it will be shown to us at a future date when we are forgetting it. That is the whole point of this program. Just as your brain is starting to dump the info out of your short-term memory, Anki tests us on it and it gets placed a little deeper into our long-term memory. This is where I have to wing it slightly because this program is designed for declarative learning and we are dealing with usually the more procedural aspect of learning art. I usually hit hard, which means the new idea will reappear every few days. This means a brand new card we've just learned will appear in 2 days, then 3 days, etc. This ensures that I practice the skill frequently, at least in the beginning, and as I become better I can train it less. If I ever want to train it a little more, I can manually set a due date which will change how the algorithm treats it and it will appear somewhat more frequently. And this is why my art shorts here on YouTube often show me practicing the same thing every few days. It's just an Anki card that is flashing up frequently. Because I tend to just hit hard, that means this card will flash up again in 6 days' time. I don't know if that's too big a gap, that's part of this experiment, but I could always manually adjust it if I wanted to study it again to say 3 days. Also, I can always circulate another card using gouache so that I'm consistently practicing gouache every few days, but just using different cards each time. The reasoning behind this training method and why it works is something called active recall. When we get asked a declarative learning question like what is chroma, we're being asked to remember the last time we considered this, and this fires up an associated neural pathway within our brains. This pushes the answer, when we retrieve it, further into long-term memory. The pathway is being reinforced biochemically. If we can't remember something, we can refresh our memory by looking at the card, hit the button to get it to flash up again soon, and hopefully we'll remember it next time. But while this is proven for declarative learning, nobody seems to be using it to track procedural things. I've structured the cards so that when a challenge pops, like paint a 4-value landscape study, I'm forced to remember the last study I did, remember what worked by reading my notes, what didn't work, and try to push further within that specific isolated artistic activity. After finishing, which I normally only allow myself 1 hour for, I then make more notes and stop for the day. This means I'm actively engaged in the thing I'm practicing, forcing myself to confront how I'm doing it, ideas for things I can try out next time, and because painting and drawing involve physical creation, everything I produce is kept so that I have a physical record of my progression as well, which is something you cannot do so easily for other procedural skills like languages. This active learning aspect is the thing that I believe is actually making the difference. I'm not just idly doodling, I am very, very intensely focused. This is another reason why I only train for 1 hour. As we will explore in future videos, it looks likely that painting for 8 hours a day, much like working out for 8 hours a day, does not actually make you improve faster, despite what most people think. The neural pathways required to physically internalize the skill of painting or drawing or anything else do not develop faster the harder you train per day. You need to stop and go do something else so that your brain can wire those connections. And this is the point where some people get angry at me, because they spend a lot of time drawing every day. The internet's full of stories about pro artists who paint for 16 hours a day and state that's how they got good and eventually employed as a senior viz dev or whatever. After all, this is the traditional way to become good at something, especially art. They give years of their lives studying and painting diligently, and I'm over here telling you that science says there is a possibility that doing less work will actually make you improve more efficiently. Now, I'm not trying to detract from the admirable amount of effort that these other artists have committed to their skill development. Clearly that level of dedication has and will work wonders for you. All I'm asking is there a more efficient way to develop? I'm not offering a cheap YouTuber shortcut to mastery, this is not a panacea, but if Da Vinci was alive today, do you think he would be interested in neuroscience? Would he stick with tradition, or would he try new things? I'll let you consider the answers to those questions yourselves. So while there is no definitive answer yet if less really is more, and we will cover the drawbacks of this method another time, the science behind it is interesting, and based on personal experience, I feel most of my biggest gains have been made by following this idea of spacing my art reps. Some days I do feel quite enthusiastic about what I'm doing, and I might spend longer than 1 hour training, but I will always take regular breaks. I cannot recall a single day in my entire life that I have spent 8 hours drawing. Whether you think that's impressive or stupid is down to you. I'm not a professional artist, of course, far from it, but as you can see I have improved over the years without having to break my back for it. All the books I've scanned into Anki form the curriculum, the knowledge I need, and the progression to take me from just drawing lines to painting concept art or whatever else I want. It's all here. I just have to bring it gradually into circulation and start training it when I feel ready to progress. This means I develop at a steady pace and can target my training based on what I want to improve on. Oh, and one more thing in case it wasn't clear, I do train like this every single day. I always have a card waiting for me to study, but it's manageable and fits around my life. I'm making constant forward progress as an artist, and this system forces me to maintain that momentum. This is by no means the only way to go about learning art, but it does give us a solid curriculum and a schedule to manage our learning. The usage of books or other decent and tested curriculum is important because, and this is a key point, what you study appears to be more important than how you study it. If you use this Anki method and study useless stuff, you will never improve. If you've never heard of Anki or spaced repetition before, but worked through something like the Scott Robertson books, there is a good chance you will end up quite skilled. I present this as one method that a keen art meta-learner could try out themselves to learn art efficiently. If you want a fast way to test this out for yourself without having to screen capture or scan pages, you could just write cards with titles or page numbers for the book in question. You could use the book, physical or digital, and just turn to the required page every day to read and then do your challenge. You could also use the back of the card to make notes, or make notes in the book. You could drop Anki entirely if you don't care about spaced repetition and just repeat the exercises every few days, which would still no doubt get you on the road to mastering these essential skills. All Anki really does for us is manage the when bit and more specifically attune it to your personal retention rate so that as your brain starts to fumble a skill, you get a refresh. These are all ways of achieving the same goal, but I personally feel that using Anki is more efficient because it handles the scheduling for you, offers a way of tracking your progress, gives you a curriculum to follow, promotes active learning, and provides an opportunity to note-take and learn how your brain works, which is something we call metacognition. There is also a decision to be made regarding what we train here. For example, do we work through the entire How to Draw book, or do we circulate some cards from something like an anatomy book or a landscape book, and learn multiple sources simultaneously within the schedule? The initial is known as blocked practice, which is studying one thing to completion before advancing. But I personally prefer to do the latter, jumping between a few resources, and the reason for this is because it taps into something called interleaving. Interleaving is simply where you mix in different subjects to study at the same time. All of these cards represent the skill pillars, so although the cards are different, I'm technically working the form pillar, whether I choose to study from how to draw or an anatomy book. But because I'm having to consider different things for each, I'm approaching the issue of form from different angles, forcing me to be creative and learn in a more multifaceted way. The same is true for switching mediums. If you cycle between using watercolours and digital painting, you should actually improve at both faster than you would improve at one on aspects of the skills that overlap. I'm sure you have lots of questions about things like spaced repetition and interleaving, especially if you've never seen anything like this before. You may even be skeptical as to if it even works. So does it? Well, for declarative learning like kaeru, it absolutely works, and there are numerous studies that prove it. For procedural learning, like art, there is a lot less data out there, but I feel we can learn a lot from analysing the way that procedural learning is systematised at various institutions. If we head over to the world of sport, we can look at how things like football are taught at academies. Every single session they practice the same fundamental skills for around 4 hours at a time. Passing, marking other players, ball control, straight line sprints, dribbling around cones, you get the idea. Now this might strike you as being incredibly boring. Every day of your career spent refining the same things you learned to do when you were 7 years old. But what's actually happening is they're just keeping their neural connections razor sharp. The art equivalent of this might be frequently drawing in perspective or quick figure gestures from life, with the wider goal of staying red hot on your skill pillars. In short, to improve, you need to drill the basics again and again and again. Every card that comes up gets me working on something basic and fundamental, so that when I do feel like producing a piece of artwork, say something for my portfolio, I can paint it and hopefully just apply these fundamental skills reflexively. This is the equivalent of those training footballers having to play a match. That is what I try and replicate with this system and Anki. I drill the fundamentals regularly, I improve steadily, and leave the scheduling to an algorithm. Then, when it's game time, I hopefully stand a better chance of succeeding. One of the most interesting concepts I've found in all of learning is the idea of compounding, which can be thought of as your skill level being the result of tiny incremental efforts. Every time you draw a head, or paint a flower, or even draw a single line, you are making very gradual, tiny improvements as an artist. You are gradually reinforcing your neural pathways. If you train every day, then when you go to bed that night, you are going to bed as a better artist than you were when you woke up that morning. This is hard to measure, as we've seen in the previous video, but it is happening. And this Anki method will help you make that automatic, as not only are we training every day, but the repeating of specific exercises over a longer time frame means we should be making incremental, compounded gains in the most relevant things on any given day. There is one more benefit to training like this. I suck at football. If somebody passed me the ball and 2 defenders are coming at me, it would take 90% of my brain power and awareness to just keep the ball at my feet as I run. I would be mown down by those defenders. But when someone passes a football to Cristiano Ronaldo, he's drilled ball control so much that he might only dedicate, let's say, 3% of his brain power and awareness to keeping the ball at his feet. Keeping the ball at his feet is an embedded reflex for him. That means he can maybe only use, say, 20% of his awareness to deal with those defenders, because he has so much experience there. That means the other allowance of his mental capacity can be dedicated to things like seeing gaps opening up between players up ahead, thinking creatively about his options with the ball, and pulling off all the other genius moves that us lay people watch and ask, how the hell did he do that? In art terms, an equivalent might be if you've never painted with gouache before. You will be spending 80% of your mental effort trying to rein in this crazy new material, so you can only dedicate 20% of your awareness to actually being able to look at your subject, its colours, its temperature, the way the light works, the soft and hard edges. The result will be a probably fairly poor painting. This frustrates you, so you give up. Maybe you don't pick the paints up again for 3 weeks, which is far too big a lapse for a newcomer. Rinse and repeat. But if you train the fundamentals with gouache consistently, take good notes, and learn actively, then it will gradually start to become reflexive. Now you can spend less of your mental capacity worrying about how gouache works, and more on things like how the light is changing temperature, leading to a deeper understanding of painting, better creative decisions, and a much lower chance of quitting. So I believe that this Anki system represents a way to help more newcomers progress to a higher level faster and more efficiently, and makes them less likely to drop off and quit, addressing something we call failure points in meta-learning, which we'll cover in detail another time. There is one more thing that those familiar with Anki might be yelling at their screens right now, which is that you can actually share Anki decks. That means, technically, I could take all of these cards I have created and just share them for you all to study from, but I sadly cannot do that for 3 reasons. The first is plain old piracy. I share a lot of work on artists in these videos who I've created decks for from their books or video courses, and that means if I share them, I will be giving away scanned versions of their books or courses for free and robbing them financially. This would totally go against my principle of promoting their work and increasing awareness of them. The second reason is that these decks were written by me, for me, based on how my brain works through trial and experimentation, which is that metacognition thing again. There is no guarantee you would understand my notes. And thirdly, related to that, is that this is an ongoing experimental process. I update my cards mostly whenever I see them again, and they've changed a lot in the last few years. This means that even if I do share the decks, you will, at best, just have the old, outdated versions that will not benefit from the new advances I make and the new research I look at. So sorry about that. Also, I still have no scientific guarantee that any of this works. I've found it helpful personally, but an N of 1 is not enough to prove a theory. And that's where it's over to you. This is all just a personal experiment that I've shared in case others want to attempt it, and I hope some of you do, and I'd love to know how you get on with it, and whether you notice any changes in the way you think about learning art. Perhaps one day, besides releasing books or courses, we'll also see spaced repetition learning media released as well, a new type of media that works with some sort of neuroscience equivalent to Kindle. The idea would be that authors, educators and the like will not just make books or videos, but this new type of media that allows learning directly through spaced repetition to help people internalize the lessons they teach and restudy them intermittently for life. I think this could change the face of education for all sorts of things, including art. And so to recap, today we have looked at what declarative and procedural knowledge and learning are and how art is mostly procedural, how spaced repetition allows us to schedule knowledge for review, promotes active recall and forces us to learn actively, how this enables us to gradually internalize skills to make them reflexive, how this then enables us to dedicate more brain power to the mastery of more advanced skills, and how all of this alongside interleaving can also make us cross-connect knowledge and experience encouraging creativity. I'll put some links to scientific papers in the description so you can read to see the benefits of this method for yourself, but it can be quite dry reading. If you want some good books to begin learning this stuff, I'd recommend anything by Barbara Oakley. On YouTube you can check out people like Justin Sung or Jim Quick, but once again their videos tend to cover more declarative learning. For a more procedural angle, the best individual I've found is Tim Ferriss, and in particular his book The 4-Hour Chef, which shows a few ways to break a procedural subject down so that it can be quickly learned, something we will be looking at in upcoming videos. Once again, he doesn't cover art, but he has started learning to draw recently, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what he uncovers there. Well, that was a lot to get through. If you managed to stick with me through all that, then well done, you've earned yourself a cup of tea. I hope that most people found that interesting and inspiring, but if you think it's pointless or that I'm mistaken, that's fine too. The great thing about science is that it's changing all the time and open for debate. As I said, my hope is that we can all grow and help one another to learn. I'd love to get this video in front of some neuroscientists and art teachers, so if you know any, please consider sharing it with them. I imagine you have many questions about this method I use, things like best practices, how often I circulate new cards, etc. And that's going to be the subject of my next video, as well as the limitations I think this spaced repetition approach has. In the meantime, please feel free to leave any questions you have about this in the comments and I'll try and address them next time. Art is ultimately about finding your own way, and what I've shared with you today is just one of an infinity of different approaches you could apply. We will look at more in the future. Please take what is useful from it, reject what is not, and do not take my word for it that it works. Instead, please think and experiment for yourselves and see what you can learn about your own brain and how it works and how you learn. Because that is an often overlooked aspect of developing as an artist.